Welcome to session 3 on the class Understanding Biblical Literature. We had started into our discussion on chapter 1, and concerning the PowerPoint that again I suggest that you have set up next to the video or open while the video is playing. We had gotten to slide number 8 and the chart that details the inspiration, transmission, translation, and interpretation of the Bible. We had finished that slide, so let's go to slide number 9, which this is where I want to start helping you to understand the development of writing. Now, this information is not in our textbook, but I think it's important that we understand just exactly, go back as far as we can concerning how the scriptures came to be. First off, like I said, we want to look at the development of writing. Writing started out as pictographic, that is, writing with pictures. You can see on this slide in the upper right hand corner there is a bird, looks more like a hawk or an eagle, but if you come down to the second line and go over, this is from the top right hand column, come down one and go over to the left one item, and you will see a wavy line. Now this is Egyptian writing. Okay, all of this chart here, or this slide, and the technical name for it is hieroglyphics. Okay, Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now, when you look at that wavy line, what does it look like? Well, it looks like water. Okay, and for the Egyptians, the main source of water was the Nile River. So in Egyptian hieroglyphics, then, this particular symbol, this particular picture, stood for the sound N, as in Nile. Okay, so therefore that was their sound. It pictured or brought about the sound N. Now, the rest of them, I haven't done enough study of hieroglyphics to know much more than that. But the only other thing that I know for sure about hieroglyphics is that when you read it, when you read hieroglyphics, you read against the faces. That is to say, if the faces are facing left, like they are here, then you would read from right to left, going against the faces. If the faces were turned around and facing to the right, then you would read left to right, going against the faces. So this is Egyptian hieroglyphics or pictographic writing. The next type of writing on the next slide, slide number 10, is called cuneiform, or wedge-shaped writing, and this was done on wet clay, and an example of it is there on the upper left of what it would look like when it was put into wet clay, and that wet clay was allowed to dry, or it was baked, and this is the product of it. And you can see it's called wedge-shaped writing or cuneiform because what they would do is they would take a stylus, a piece of metal or wood that had a sharp point on it, and they would press that down into the clay and they would press it down more at an angle to make that wedge at the top or at the side of on one end of the line, as you can see from what's going on here in the example at the bottom right. They would push that down, and then they would either bring it down and come across to make the line, or come down to make the line, whichever way it's going, and that would stand for a syllable. Now this is what is known as syllabic writing. Okay, that is the symbol there may stand for the symbol there may stand for the syllable SU or ER or whatever, no more than 2 or 3 letters at a time. But that's the basic understanding of this type of writing. Now, if you go down, if you count down, you got your top line, your second line, and then your third line. Somewhere there near the middle, if you're counting, let's just count from the left to the right. On the third line, you have one big symbol, another big symbol, and the third one that looks like a star is actually the sign, the cuneiform sign for God or God's deity. It is the sign for the letters EL, L, if I remember correctly. So each symbol has its own syllable designation, and I do believe there's about 612 different signs that you have to learn in order to be able to read this type of language. Now, another thing that is important here is that this cuneiform was used to write several languages. That is to say, it was used to write in the Sumerian language. It was used to write in the Akkadian language. And then under the Akkadian, you have Assyrian Akkadian, you have Babylonian Akkadian, and then you have Old Babylonian Akkadian and New Babylonian Akkadian. So there are several different languages there that are included that can be written with this type of writing, this wedge-shaped or cuneiform writing. So you can see how the language develops from pictographic, and this is, I guess you could, this is technically pictographic, writing in pictures, but it's again wedge-shaped or cuneiform, and each symbol stands for a syllable. Now, as writing continued to develop, you have here the development from pictographic in one way on the left-hand side, the left-hand column there, with a man at the top, okay, and just a little line at the bottom. And then the next column over is, I believe, Paleo-Hebrew, where the sign on the left, the picture on the left, has been changed to write it a little bit easier. And then the next column, the third column of symbols, is actually Greek. And then on the fourth column, actually, if you start with the words on the left, that was, let's just call that column number 1, and then the pictures column number 2, and then the what's becoming letters, but it's still pictographic, is column number 3, and then the Greek is column number 4, and then the sound that is that comes from it, from that symbol or that letter, is in the fifth column, and then the meaning, the definition of that that particular letter stands for, or is the first letter in the word for that definition, is in the sixth column. Now let's just go through a few of these. Let's just start with cough. That's K-A-P-H. Now, you see the definition on the other side of the page, but when you do something like this, okay, what does that look like? Okay, or you've got 4 things standing up with a line below them connecting them. So if you've got 4 fingers in this case, or just if you had a fifth one there, which it's not, but in this case you got 4 fingers, so it looks like a hand. And then that became the paleo cough, okay, but in biblical Hebrew, the Paleo Hebrew cough, okay, in biblical Hebrew, that had evolved into a symbol like this. So the cough, actually it's like this. You just draw it, this way, and so the idea is that's a hand in Hebrew. Okay. Now, the word for hand in Greek. Let me look at something here real quick. I've forgotten what the word hand. Well, I just lost the book that I wanted to look it up in. Well, it's not coming up very well. Well, I can't find it right off the top of my, real quick here, so we won't spend any more time on it. But let's go on down to the mem, M-E-M. Now we've got the same symbol here as we did in Egyptian hieroglyphics, but in this case, because it is moving into Hebrew, All right. The Hebrew word for excuse me, for water is mayim. So the Hebrews got from this symbol of wavy lines, which would be water, okay, the Hebrews took the letter M from that, and therefore it became the M in Greek. And even though the word for water in Greek doesn't start with an M, again it did in Hebrew, and therefore it has the definition of water. Now, next is noon. Uh, the noon, again, this is the you have what looks very much like a snake there in in the picture, and next you have what looks like an N, and then that became the N in Greek. In the Paleo Hebrew, it's the N sound, and it means snake. At least the picture does. Now, let me look real quick for the Greek word for snake. Actually, there are several words for snake, and I don't see any of them starting with an N in the Greek. But let me do a search real quick in Hebrew. I've again forgotten the yeah, in Hebrew it doesn't start with an N. So, but again, the N sound comes from that idea. Now, the last one I want to point out is what is you look at ayin, which is the symbol in the AYIN. You have what looks like an eye, then an eye in your head, and then it becomes in the Paleo Hebrew it becomes a kind of like an oblong O, okay, and then in Greek it becomes the O, all right, and then that symbol again is for the eye, not necessarily in Greek. Let me again look real quick for this, see if I can. It escapes me as to what the Greek word for eye is. Okay, so it is the Greek word oma, so it does start with an O. So you have an eye, again, the thing that we see with, all the way across on that line. So it started out as the symbol for an eye, and then it just became an O, and then an O in Paleo Hebrew and an O in Greek, and then again it's the symbol for an eye. So you can see the development. The main point we get here is we can see the development from the pictographic to the alphabetic. Okay, and the very word alphabetic actually comes from the Greek because the first two letters of the Greek alphabet is alpha and beta. So that's how we got our name alphabet, okay, or alphabetic. Let's see if there's anything else I want to say about this chart. I guess not. But let's. You know, when we talk about the development of the alphabet, you know, languages, as we've said before, are evolving all the time. You know, it doesn't change overnight, obviously. Excuse me. But it does change over a period of years and or decades. Now, one thing that I had experience with in the Air Force, when I was in the Air Force back from '84 to '88, I was stationed in Holland, the Netherlands, for 2 years, and I got the chance to go over into Germany a good bit. I also, you know, got the chance to go to England and everything. But when you have, you know, if you're looking at a map going west, okay, you have Germany, Holland, and England. You can see, if you just write down, you know, some of the German language next to some of the Dutch language, and then you've got English, you can see the progression of the language as you move across the continents. Just take the numbers for example. 1, 2, 3 in English. In German is ein, zwei, drei. Okay, ein, zwei, drei. And in Dutch, it's een, twee, drie. Okay, so ein, zwei, drei, een, twee, drie. I'm sorry, yeah, een, twee, drie, and then 1, 2, 3. So in English, so you have that, you see that progression. So that's the same idea here as to what we're talking about. The progression of language, in this case, the progression of writing, as to how it changed over time. All right, now let's get into the writing materials, which will be slide number 12. In this case, we simply want to point out that the writing materials also progressed over time. In this case, in slide number 12, you have the examples of, in this case, clay. We don't have any pictures of stone here, but I guess we could find some and include it. But in this case, we have clay, and again, in this case, we have cuneiform writing, which has been put on these pieces of clay when they were wet, and then again they were baked or allowed to dry some other way. But you know, clay was the writing medium for many years, and stone, as you know, we have the 10 Commandments, or actually not the 10 Commandments, the law of God written on stone. So this is the beginning of writing materials. And then later on, we move to leather. Now, this is slide 13. We have leather, which there are actually several different grades of leather, if you want to call it that. There's parchment, which was just treated leather with writing on it. In this case, you have parchment is on the right, parchment leaf from a small codex, a Greek version of Psalm, I think that's Psalms 4 through 8. I'm sorry, it's Psalm 3, 4 through 8 is what it is. And that's from the 5th century AD. But on the left, you have vellum. This is a Coptic manuscript on vellum from the Old Testament, a portion of the Old Testament from the 10th century AD. And again, it's in Greek. The difference between parchment and vellum was just a matter of quality. The vellum was a higher grade or higher quality of leather. So it probably had some extra things done to it to make it a better grade of leather. So both of those words, parchment and vellum, if you ever see them, they're both referring to the same material, which is leather. And slide number 14, we have the writing material known as papyrus. This was made from the papyrus plant, and what it was is the papyrus plant was something that grew especially in the on the edges of the Nile River. And what they would do is they would take that and they would beat it out and it would break up into fibers. Okay, those fibers, I can't remember whether they dried the leaf or the stalk of the papyrus plant first and then beat it into fibers, or whether they beat it into fibers and then allowed the fibers to dry. I'd have to go back and read some more on that process. But when those fibers were dry, they would lay them down, just in this direction, and then they would take another set of fibers or part of the dried leaf or whatever, strips of it, and would lay it across, okay, and then they would go again up and down. So you can almost see the fibers in the picture if you make that go as large as you can get it without making it fuzzy or anything. You can see not only the lines of writing, which are not very clear, but you can also see the grain. You can see the grain of the fibers going up and down, and you can see the grain of the fibers going across. This is, again, one of the writing materials. Now, this particular papyrus, or in this case, there's actually it's just one, and what they're doing is they're showing you, well, no, it's not just one, it's two pieces. So we would call this papyri, P-A-P-Y-R-I, I think it's either one I or two I's. But what you have is, this is Papyrus, Michigan. The inverse of it, 7018. This was papyrus that was recycled as mummy cartonnage. Now, just exactly what does that mean? It is according to Wikipedia, it's a type of material used in ancient Egyptian funerary masks from the first intermediate period to the Roman era. It was made of layers of linen or papyrus covered with plaster. Some of the Fayum mummy portraits are also painted on panels made of this material. So you have, this is again papyrus covered with plaster that was used in, I guess we could say caskets of mummies to maybe identify who is in there, or to put in prayers or something along those lines to the gods, so that their soul would cross over, peacefully, or whatever. Things like that would be on these pieces of material. Now in slide number 15, we have more papyrus. Again, if you make that large enough, you can see the fibers, the pieces of the papyrus running both ways, up and down and across, and you see the Greek writing on there. This is actually, if I'm looking at it correctly, it's all capital Greek letters. At least that's what it looks like from here. Could be wrong, but I think that's what it is. But again, this is from the collection of the Papyri, Michigan, 3106, and it's a royal decree coming from 237 BC. Now, the next piece of type of material that was used for writing was pottery. Now, this actually went back to further back than papyrus or leather. This was back in the time when they were using clay and stone, and in this case pottery. The pieces of pottery that had been broken fragments, or potsherds is another way of speaking of it. But the technical term is ostrakon for the singular, that is just one piece, or ostraka when you're speaking of multiple pieces. Okay? Now, this is significant in that, you can see, the writing on here. They would take, burned ashes or something like that, and mix them with water to make a black ink-like substance. And then they would, or I say burned ashes, burned wood, okay, they would, grind that up and mix it with water. But they would take this and they would just, have a broken piece of pottery, write on it what they wanted to write on it, and send it to the person to whom they're writing. Now, this is extremely significant in the fact that we have what are known as the letters of Lachish, which were written between a soldier and his commander, and some back and forth correspondence. These were found at the city of Lachish, and they were letters saying, basically, this is the status of our, our people. This is what we know about the enemy. This is what we know about other forts, or fortresses or camps of the army. In fact, on there it says, it uses the word for fire or fire signal, and in one part of it says, we cannot see the signal fire of Azekah. Okay, so if you look on a map, you have Lachish, and then you have Azekah several miles away. And what they would do is they would light a fire, a big fire, so that you could see the other fortress nearest to you, or if there's others around you. And when that fire went out, you knew that the city or the fort had been taken by the enemy. So when the soldier says to his commander, I cannot see the fires of Azekah, or the signal fire of Azekah, he's telling him that it's likely, very likely, that the city or the fortress had been taken at Azekah. Now, what's interesting about that whole situation is that the word for signal fire is found only one time in the Bible, and it's found in the book of Jeremiah. So this, and it talks about the signal fires in the book of Jeremiah, but that's a connection that helps us to date these particular things, these ostraka. Another thing that's a connection to the book of Jeremiah from the Lachish letters is that Jeremiah was telling the people. It said, Jeremiah's message to the people was, give up, hand yourselves over to the Babylonians, because this is God's will. And he tells the king, surrender to the Babylonians and you'll save your life. You'll save a lot of lives. So he's telling them again, to give in, to surrender. Well, the phrase, let me just look that up real quick. Okay. Well, the phrase I was thinking of is not exactly found here, but basically this connection between the Lachish letters and the prophet Jeremiah is the fact that in the Lachish letters it says that there are some prophets who are weakening the hands of the people, that is the soldiers and the people, because basically what they're saying is that they're being discouraged by some of the prophets. And if you understand that to be like Jeremiah telling them to surrender, then an army, a military, would consider that discouraging. He's trying to discourage us from fighting. So there's that connection between the Lachish letters, the weakening of the hands, discouragement, and the message of Jeremiah in telling them to surrender. So just some interesting points concerning pottery and how it was used and how it plays into the Bible, the archaeology of the Bible. Now, concerning writing materials, on the next slide, slide 17, other writing materials were paper, wax, wood, gold, silver, and copper. In fact, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls um, which was found again at Qumran, which we referenced back in session 2. One of the Dead Sea Scrolls was written on copper, and because it was, it was old and it was somewhat brittle, um, the, the finders, the one who were working with it, trying to figure out what it said, had a time with getting it open without breaking it up. So finally, what they ended up doing, if I remember correctly, is they ended up cutting slivers of it, maybe a half inch or an inch or so at a time, off of the scroll, as they went around it, and they laid those pieces side by side until they came up with, opened it completely up and had it out there flat. Well, that particular scroll was a copy of Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, and I believe most of the book was found there. Let me see here. If you look up the Isaiah scroll on Wikipedia, you say Isaiah scroll. It's designated 1Q ISA A superscript, and what that stands for is 1 stands for the cave number, and then Q stands for Qumran, and then ISA stands for Isaiah, and then A stands for the first copy that was found, or at least that was studied. And then if they found another one, it would be, in the same cave, it would be 1QISAB. But you can see, if you go to Wikipedia and you look up Isaiah scroll, you can see a picture off to the right of where they have gotten it apart, and I think that well, evidently this was not a copper one. I was under the impression that it was. So let's go back and okay, I was wrong. I'm sorry. If you look up the copper scroll on Wikipedia, you can see a picture on the right hand side of where they had cut the pieces of copper, or the scroll, into pieces, and then laid it side by side to to show it, and you can see the Hebrew writing on it. But I'm trying to see what exactly was on this scroll. It was found in Cave 3. Cave 3 of Qumran, 3Q, and 15 is the 15th scroll that was found there. It says it was copper mixed with about 1% tin. It is not a literary work, but a list of places where various items of gold and silver are buried or hidden. It differs from the other scrolls in its Hebrew. It's closer to the language of the Mishnah than to the literary Hebrew of the other scrolls, though 4Q MMT shares some language characteristics. Its orthography and paleography, forms of letters, and date from 50 to 100 CE or AD, possibly overlapping the latest of the other Qumran manuscripts. And it is on display in the Jordan Museum in Amman, Jordan. So I was mistaken. I'm sorry. I thought it was of Isaiah, but it's not. But the Isaiah scroll is, as we said, is on. See, it's the oldest copy of the book of Isaiah, being approximately 1,000 years older than the Hebrew manuscripts known before the scroll's discovery. It is notable. 1Q ISAA is also notable in being the only scroll from the Qumran caves to be preserved almost in its entirety. And the scroll is written on 17 sheets of parchment. Now again, the word parchment is just one way of speaking of a certain grade of leather. Okay? I just wanted you to know about those things. But there were some scrolls, at least one scroll in the Dead Sea Scrolls that was written on copper. I was just mistaken as to what was on it. Now, so that covers writing materials. Again, the last slide is slide 17. Now we move to slide 18, which is simply our introduction slide to the idea of translations. We have a brief survey of Bible translation. Now, let me... Okay, we've got about 13 minutes left in this session, so we'll try to get through as much as we can. On this introduction slide, what you have is a painting of Jerome writing. Now, this is certainly not done, in the time of Jerome, which was about 400 AD. But this is a painting by Caravaggio. It is housed in the Galleria Borghese in Rome, and it has been suggested that this is Caravaggio's interpretation of Jerome's translation process of the Hebrew and Greek text into Latin. Now, that's what we want to talk about next in slide number 19, is the translation that was completed by Jerome around the year 400 AD, and it's called the Vulgate. Again, it was translated from the Hebrew and the Greek into Latin, and that would also include the Aramaic, because the Old Testament is written in Hebrew and Aramaic, and the New Testament in Greek. But it's called the Vulgate because in Latin, the word vulgar, vulgar, is simply the word for common. Okay, so this was written in such a way that the common man could understand it. The main language of the day, was Latin. So, it was called the Vulgate. Now, this was commonly used, as the slide says, in the British Isles for about 1,000 years. And it became the official translation of the Catholic Church later on, when the Catholic Church became, more structured and so forth. In fact, if I remember correctly, one of the one of the leaders in the Catholic Church commissioned Jerome to make this Latin translation, and therefore it became the official Bible of the Catholic Church. And this is going to play into our discussion later about other translations, and that is that for many, many years, for centuries, this Bible, the Latin Bible known as the Vulgate, and different revisions and changes and so forth that came across, but all the different versions of the Vulgate, being again the official Bible of the Catholic Church, it became more of a Bible for the leadership, for the elite, okay, and therefore it came to the point where only the priests and the bishops and the the leaders of the church, not just the Catholic Church, but also the Church of England and others throughout the world, this Latin translation, the Vulgate, became their Bible, and nobody else, or very few other people, could read it. And they kept it in Latin, even in countries where Latin was not the main language, or any part of the language, the speaking of it at all, and therefore only the leadership of the church knew what the Bible said. Now this is the time period that is appropriately called the Dark Ages, because everybody's in the dark concerning what the Word of God says, except for the leadership of the church. Now, that was certainly an extremely sad time, because all the people had to rely on, or at least what most people had to rely on, was what the priest or the church leader said the Bible said. When the Bible was translated into English and other languages such as German and French and so forth, when that happened, then that, with the, as we will see in a moment, with the advent of the printing press and an interest in classical languages such as Greek and Hebrew, when those things came about, the Reformation and so forth, then we come to the period of the Enlightenment, where, when God's Word comes into the language of the common person, then, light has dawned. Everybody becomes enlightened because of their ability to have access to the Word of God. Now, another translation that I don't have a slide on is actually older than the Vulgate, and it has to do simply with the translation of the Old Testament into Greek. Now, this occurred probably from 400 BC or so. I don't have the exact dates on it. Again, I guess I could look it up to get the I used to know the exact dates, but this says that it was translated, at least the first 5 books of the Old Testament were translated in the mid-3rd century BC, so that would be the mid-200s, around 250 or so. And then the rest of the Old Testament was translated over time up until the 2nd century AD. Okay, So, and the reason this was done, it's called the Septuagint, Septuagint, and again, you can look it up on Wikipedia. It's called the Septuagint, and it's also referred to as the LXX. Now, in Latin, if you know your Roman numerals, the LXX stands for the number 70. And that's, again, the reason it's called the Septuagint. And this is because the reason the number 70 is put on it, because the tradition, we don't know exactly how true it is, but the tradition surrounding this translation, this comes from the letter of Aristeas, Aristeas. The letter of Aristeas said that the leader of Egypt, the Pharaoh, or I guess at that time they weren't being called pharaohs, but he commissioned, again according to this particular letter, the leader of Egypt commissioned the Jews to put together a committee of translators to translate the Hebrew Old Testament, Hebrew and Aramaic Old Testament, into Greek. And he commissioned it for, if I remember the details of the letter, he commissioned it for his library, or the library in Alexandria. Well, the tradition goes that when the Jewish leaders put this group of translators together, they chose 6 people from each tribe of Israel. So you've got 12 tribes, and therefore there were 72 translators. So that's how the number 70, or the name Septuagint, or again LXX, came to be appended to, or given, this translation was given that name because of the 72 translators. They just rounded it off to 70. Now, there are other things that the letter of Aristeas covers, but again, we don't believe that there's much truth to it, if any. Basically what we think the letter of Aristeas was trying to do was to claim inspiration for the Septuagint, claim the inspiration of God for the Septuagint, because part of the tradition from that particular letter, part of what that letter said, was that each one of these 72 went into separate rooms, and they all came out with the very same translation. Every letter, every word was exactly the same. And, again, there's not much stock put in that tradition, because when we compare the Hebrew Old Testament to the Greek Old Testament, the translation of the Old Testament into Greek, when we compare the two, there are many times, very big differences between the texts. Sometimes, one book will be translated very literally, almost a word-for-word wooden translation that doesn't make a lot of sense, or it's very hard to understand. But then another book of the Old Testament will be translated very loosely, almost kind of like a paraphrase, which we'll get into later. But because of the varying translation styles, and because of the huge differences sometimes between what the Hebrew said and what the Greek said, and I say huge differences, there are sometimes that things are added, and sometimes that things are taken away, and sometimes things are said just, differently. doesn't really match up. Because of that, we understand that the letter of Aristeas really doesn't hold much truth to it at all. So, I've probably given you more on the Septuagint here than you really wanted to know, but that really was, as far as we understand it, the first translation of the Bible. Again, from Hebrew and Aramaic into Greek, and it was only the Old Testament. The New Testament, at least for the most part, had not been written yet when the writing of the New Testament probably started, or some people date it as early as the late 40s A.D. Some people want to put it in the 50s as to when it began. Matthew being the first gospel that was written, the book of Galatians being the first letter that was written, and probably the first document that was written of the New Testament by Paul. Like I said, some people want to date that even back into the late 40s, but probably in the early 50s is more in line with what is probably true. But so you have the Septuagint, and then next you have the Vulgate, but there are other translations and so forth in there between the Septuagint and the Vulgate. There's the Syriac, there's the Latin, and so forth of the New Testament especially being translated. Okay, well that gets us to a little over an hour. So what we'll do is we'll pick up with slide number 20 and English translations prior to 1611 in the next session. As always, understand please that I'm here to help, and call on me anytime, again, for anything, even if it doesn't pertain to this class. If I can help you in any way, I'll be glad to do it. Have a great day.